The warning ignored. Sua had always been drawn to mirrors. They adorned every wall of her modest apartment, tall, gold-framed mirrors in the hallway, ornate vanity mirrors in her bedroom, a sleek, modern mirror in the living room. She believed they brightened her space, reflecting the soft glow of her scented candles and the warmth of her home. She wasn't vain. No, not at all. But she loved the way mirrors held reflections, not just of herself, but of the world around her. To her, mirrors were gateways to beauty, to clarity. She had never considered the possibility that they could also be gateways to something else. The beggar's warning. That evening, as the orange sun dipped below the rooftops, Sua took her usual shortcut home through the narrow alleyway behind the market. The street was bustling, the air thick with the aromas of fried plantains, roasted corn, and simmering peppers. Vendors shouted prices, bargaining with late shoppers. The world felt alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of the city. Then, as she turned the corner, she saw her. A frail elderly woman sat by the side of the road, wrapped in a faded cloth, her hands stretched out for alms. Her hair was thin and grey, her skin like wrinkled parchment, her eyes milky white, as if she had spent her entire life staring into something too deep to comprehend. Sua hesitated. There was something about the old woman that made her stomach tighten. As she tried to step past her, the beggar's hand shot out, gripping Sua's wrist with surprising strength. "My daughter," the woman croaked, her voice dry and cracked like an old tree in harmattan. Sua flinched. "Excuse me." The old woman's fingernails dug into her skin, her grip unnaturally cold. "Never look into a mirror when the moon is at its highest," she whispered. "Or something will look back at you." Sua felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She pulled her hand free, forcing a nervous laugh. "Old woman, if you need money, just say so." She reached into her purse, pulled out a few naira notes, and dropped them into the woman's outstretched hand. But the beggar did not let go. Instead, she gripped Sua's fingers tighter and spoke again. This time, her voice was lower, darker. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." A heavy silence settled between them. For the first time, Sua felt uneasy. The woman's cloudy eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed as though she could see perfectly. Sua yanked her hand back. "Good night, Mama," she muttered and walked away quickly, shaking off the strange encounter. She didn't look back. Maybe she should have. Midnight reflections. By the time she arrived home, the encounter with the beggar was already a distant memory. She tossed her bag on the couch, kicked off her shoes, and turned on her favorite Afrobeats playlist. Music filled the apartment as she danced around the kitchen, humming along as she made herself a cup of hibiscus tea. The beggar's warning. Ridiculous. Superstitions were for people who lived in the past, for those who still believed in village tales about spirits and curses. Sua was a modern woman. She didn't believe in witches or spirits hiding in mirrors. And yet, as she settled into bed, scrolling through her phone, her eyes flickered toward her vanity mirror, just for a moment. The beggar's words whispered in her mind. "Never look into a mirror when the moon is at its highest, or something will look back at you." Sua rolled her eyes and turned onto her side, tucking herself under the covers. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't. She closed her eyes. Outside, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft silver glow through the curtains. 12 a.m. The city outside wasn't completely quiet. Distant car horns blared, muffled laughter echoed from passing pedestrians, the occasional bark of a stray dog. Sua lay still, breathing evenly. And then, something moved. She wasn't moving. But in the mirror, her reflection shifted. Sua's breath hitched. Slowly, she turned her head toward the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal. Her reflection lay in bed just like her, the room cast in the same soft shadows. Then, her reflection smiled. Sua's stomach dropped. She wasn't smiling. Her lips were pressed together in silent terror, but the woman in the mirror was grinning, wide, unnatural, teeth glinting under the moonlight. Her chest tightened. This isn't real. This can't be real. She sat up, so did the reflection. She raised a trembling hand, so did the reflection. But then, she stopped moving. And the reflection kept going. It tilted its head, blinking slowly, still grinning. Sua's breath caught in her throat. Her heartbeat thundered loud enough to drown out the city outside. This is a dream. A trick of the light. Her mind is just playing games. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a shaky breath. When she opened them again, her reflection was normal again. Still. Unmoving. Just a reflection. Sua let out a nervous laugh, rubbing her face. I need sleep, she whispered to herself. She grabbed the nearest scarf and draped it over the mirror, blocking its surface from view. Then she turned off the light. Pulled the covers over her head. Tried to ignore the crawling sensation on the back of her neck. And she didn't see the reflection behind the cloth. Still grinning. Still watching. Still waiting, the reflection moves on its own. Sua barely slept. Even after covering the mirror with a scarf, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Her body was exhausted, but her mind raced, replaying the impossible moment over and over again. Her reflection had smiled on its own. Had she imagined it? Had she been so tired that her eyes played tricks on her? When morning finally arrived, she forced herself to believe it had all been a dream. She peeled herself out of bed, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes, and made her way to the bathroom. She turned on the sink, splashing cold water on her face. Then, she looked up at the bathroom mirror. Her reflection stared back. Nothing strange. Nothing wrong. She let out a breath. See? Nothing to be afraid of. She reached for a towel. And her reflection didn't move. Sua froze, her fingers tightening around the fabric. Her reflection still had both hands at her sides, even though her own hand was raised. Her chest tightened, a sharp coldness creeping up her spine. She slowly lowered her hand. The reflection smiled. Sua stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of lotion. Her real face wasn't smiling. Her lips were parted in pure horror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the reflection? It was still grinning. A slow, deliberate smile. Sua blinked. And in that split second, her reflection corrected itself, matching her once again. Her head spun. She braced herself against the sink, breathing hard, willing her heartbeat to slow. This isn't real. I'm just tired. That was the only logical explanation. She shook her head, turned away from the mirror, and forced herself to get ready for work. Something feels off. Sua stepped into the crowded bus, pressing herself between other commuters, grateful for the distraction. The city was alive as usual, street vendors calling out deals, motorbikes weaving through traffic, the scent of roasted corn in the air. But something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was there, a nagging sense of wrongness. As she glanced out the window, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. At first, it was normal. Then, for a split second, it wasn't. Her reflection turned its head to look at her, but she hadn't moved. Sua sucked in a breath and jerked away from the window. She refused to look at her reflection for the rest of the ride. The office mirror. By the time she arrived at work, she convinced herself she was imagining things. Her job as a bank teller required complete focus. She needed to push these ridiculous thoughts aside and concentrate. The morning passed in a blur of transactions, cash counting, and customer inquiries. Then, she saw it again. Sua had been handing a receipt to a client when she caught a glimpse of herself in the bank's glass partition. Her reflection blinked slower than she did. It wasn't just a delay. It was intentional. As if it knew she was watching. Her blood ran cold. Sua snapped her head toward the glass, hoping to see her reflection back to normal. But for half a second, it wasn't. It was smiling. Sua gasped, the receipt slipping from her fingers. The customer frowned. "Miss, are you okay?" She forced a smile, her throat tight. "Yes, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She was losing her mind. "You look pale." At lunch, Sua sat across from Tommy, her best friend and coworker. Tommy frowned, stirring her spoon through a bowl of jollof rice. "You look terrible." Sua let out a weak laugh, pushing her food around her plate. "Thanks for the confidence boost." "I'm serious," Tommy pressed, narrowing her eyes. "You look pale. And you're acting weird." Sua hesitated. Should she tell Tommy? No. It sounded crazy. She wasn't even sure what was happening herself. "I'm just not sleeping well," she said instead, forcing a smile. Tommy didn't look convinced. "Are you sure? You've been staring off into space all day." Sua nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Because just beyond Tommy's shoulder, there was a window reflecting their table. And in that reflection, Sua's double wasn't eating. It was watching her. Smiling. The market stall. After work, Sua decided to stop by the market. Maybe she just needed to clear her head. The streets were buzzing with life, vendors selling spices, baskets of yams, dried fish hanging from stalls. The normalcy of it all soothed her frayed nerves. Then, she saw the mirror store. A merchant had lined his booth with dozens of mirrors, small, handheld mirrors, decorative vanity pieces, tall standing mirrors with wooden carvings. Sua's steps slowed. The mirrors seemed to be facing her directly. Their glass surfaces gleamed under the dimming sunlight, reflecting everything, the market, the people, the sky. And her. Sua swallowed hard, taking a single hesitant step forward. She was right in front of the largest mirror now. She wasn't going to be afraid. She was going to prove to herself that there was nothing wrong. She forced herself to look. Her reflection stood there. Still. Motionless. Sua tilted her head. The reflection stayed still. She lifted a hand. The reflection lifted its own. Then, Sua turned her head slightly to the right. And in the mirror, her reflection didn't follow. It kept staring at her. Even though she was no longer looking at it. Sua's blood turned to ice. She snapped away from the mirror, her heart hammering. The merchant chuckled. "Madam, you go by or just they look?" She didn't answer. She was already walking away. Her hands felt ice cold. Her stomach twisted. Something was wrong. And no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she couldn't escape the truth. Something was watching her. And it was waiting. The unseen presence. Sua was running on pure exhaustion. She barely ate. Barely slept. The events of the past few days had chipped away at her sanity, leaving her feeling hollow and frayed at the edges. She told herself, it's just stress. Just lack of sleep. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Something was wrong. Something was watching her. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, it was getting worse. The shifting room. That morning, Sua woke up feeling heavier than usual, as if her body was pinned down by an invisible force. Her breath was slow. Her limbs were stiff. It took effort, too much effort, to sit up. Then she noticed it. Her room was different. Her full-length mirror, the one she had draped with a scarf, was slightly angled toward her bed. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that it had been facing the wall when she went to sleep. Her vanity mirror, too, was tilted ever so slightly, revealing the faint outline of her reflection through the cloth covering it. And her nightstand drawer was open even though she hadn't touched it. Her breath hitched. Sua's stomach twisted with unease as she slowly got out of bed. The floor felt colder than usual, as if something had been standing there before her. She moved toward the full-length mirror, her pulse pounding. Maybe it had just shifted on its own. Maybe she had bumped into it last night. Maybe. She reached out to straighten it. And her reflection moved before she did. Sua staggered back, her pulse exploding in panic. The scarf slipped off slightly, revealing more of the mirror surface, but when she looked closer, her reflection was perfectly normal again. Sua shut her eyes tightly, willing her heartbeat to slow. I'm just tired. I'm just imagining things. But deep inside, she knew. She wasn't imagining anything. The whisper in the mirror. That night, the whispering started. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling sound, barely noticeable over the hum of the ceiling fan. Sua lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block it out. But then, she heard it again. A whisper. A soft, deliberate murmur, coming from the direction of the covered mirror. Sua froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as she strained to listen. The whispering was low, almost intelligible, like the wind blowing through hollow wood. But then, Sua. Her entire body went cold. That was her name. Someone was saying her name. She threw the blanket over her head, curling into herself, her entire body shaking. She wouldn't look. She couldn't look. The whispering continued, slow and patient, weaving through the darkness. But she refused to move. Refused to listen. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the whispering stopped. And in the silence that followed, she knew. Whatever was in that mirror was waiting. Tommy sees the truth. Sua needed to get out of the house. She hadn't been to Tommy's apartment in weeks, but today, she practically begged her friend to let her come over. Tommy, ever the supportive best friend, welcomed her with open arms and a concerned look. "Girl, you look like you haven't slept in years," Tommy said, handing her a glass of fresh juice. "Are you sick?" Sua forced a weak smile, shaking her head. "Just stressed." She wasn't ready to explain. She wasn't ready to say, "Hey, Tommy, my reflection is moving on its own." Who would believe that? Sua sat on the couch, trying to soak in the warmth of her best friend's home, the familiar smell of lavender, the clutter of magazines on the table, the soft chatter of the TV in the background. For the first time in days, she felt safe. Until Tommy suddenly went pale. She was staring at the mirror on the wall, her hands trembling. Sua's blood ran cold. "What?" Sua whispered, turning to look. And then she saw it. Her reflection was missing. Tommy stumbled back, nearly dropping her drink. "Sua, where's your?" Then she screamed. Because in the reflection, something else was there. A dark, faceless figure, standing right behind Sua. Sua spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing. But in the mirror, the thing didn't move. It just stood there. Watching. Waiting. Sua's chest tightened with sheer terror. Tommy grabbed her wrist. "Sua, we are leaving. Now." Sua didn't argue. They fled from the apartment, slamming the door behind them. But before they left, Sua took one last glance at the mirror. And for a split second, the faceless figure smiled. The covered mirrors. Sua was done pretending. She was done ignoring this. That night, she covered every single mirror in her home, even the small ones, even the ones on her phone and laptop screen. If she couldn't see them, then they couldn't see her. She felt safer. For a while. Until the tapping started. It was soft at first. A light tap, tap, tap from beneath the cloth covering the mirror. Sua held her breath, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Then, Sua. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself against the headboard. Sua, look at me. No. No, no, no. The tapping grew louder. More insistent. And then, a low chuckle. Sua couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, she reached out, grabbing the edge of the cloth. And then, with one swift motion, she pulled it away. Her reflection was there. But it wasn't her. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. It tilted its head at her, as if studying her fear. And then, it moved. Not like a reflection. Like a separate entity. It stepped forward. Sua screamed, throwing herself backward. The lights flickered. The air grew thick, suffocating. And for the first time, she knew, with absolute certainty. Her reflection wasn't just watching her anymore. It was trying to take her place. The reflection wants out. Sua was drowning in terror. It was no longer just a feeling. No longer just a shadow in the glass. Her reflection was alive. And it wanted to take her place. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of her room, eyes fixed on the covered mirrors, heart pounding with every second that passed. The whispering didn't stop. The tapping didn't stop. And just before dawn, the whispering voice changed. Soon, Sua bolted out of her apartment at sunrise. She couldn't stay here anymore. She needed help. Real help. And she knew exactly where to find it. The village elder. The journey to the village took 2 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Sua had grown up hearing stories about the shaman of Oloren Hill, an elder who had lived longer than anyone could remember, a man who spoke to spirits and walked between worlds. She had never believed in his power before. Now, she desperately needed to. When she arrived, the village was quiet, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and distant rain. An old woman guided her up the hill, past rows of huts, past wooden totems carved with strange symbols. The shaman's home was small and ancient, a simple hut surrounded by wind chimes made of bone and metal. Inside, a single oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And there, seated on a woven mat, was the shaman himself. His eyes were milky white, but he saw her the moment she stepped inside. "You have been touched," he murmured. Sua's throat tightened. She hadn't told him anything yet. The truth about the mirror spirit. Sua fell to her knees, her voice breaking as she told him everything. The beggar's warning. The smiling reflection. The shifting mirrors. The way her reflection had started moving on its own. The way it had tried to step forward. When she finished, the shaman remained silent. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "You should never have ignored the warning, child." His tone wasn't angry. It was sorrowful. "The spirit in the mirror has chosen you." Sua's chest tightened. "Chosen me for what?" The shaman's voice was heavy with regret. "To take your place. The spirit that takes." Sua listened in horror as the shaman explained. There were spirits that lived between mirrors, trapped in the reflections of the world. Once, long ago, a group of elders sealed them away, ensuring they could never escape. But mirrors. Mirrors were not just glass. They were doors. And sometimes, those doors were left open. "It waits for you, Sua," the shaman said, his expression grim. It waits for you to look too long. To blink. To sleep, just for a moment. That is when it will take you. Sua's skin went cold. She had seen it watching her. Had felt it waiting. What do I do? She whispered. The shaman reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a mirror no bigger than a hand. Its glass was dark, like the surface of a still lake under a moonless sky. This is your only chance, he said. Tonight, when the moon is at its highest, you must face it again. But this time, you must not blink. Not once. If you blink, it will take you. Sua shuddered. And if I succeed, she asked. The shaman's white eyes bore into her soul. Then you will close the door, forever. The longest night. Sua returned to the city just before sunset. She had spent the entire ride by gripping the enchanted mirror, her hands clammy, her mind racing. Tonight, she would have to face it. And if she failed, if she blinked, she would be gone. As soon as she stepped into her apartment, she felt it. The air was wrong. The apartment was too quiet. The shadows were too deep. And the mirrors were waiting. She took a shaky breath, then walked straight to her bedroom. The full-length mirror stood where she had left it, its surface hidden beneath the cloth. She knew the moment she removed it, there would be no going back. Her hands trembled as she reached forward. And then, knock. A single, deliberate knock from inside the mirror. Sua's breath caught in her throat. Then, knock. 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 Slow. Deliberate. Like it knew she was there. Like it was inviting her in. She clenched her fist. No more running. With one swift motion, she ripped the cloth away. And there it was. Her reflection. Smiling. Waiting. And this time, it moved first. The reflection takes control. Sua barely made it through the night. She had stared into the mirror for what felt like hours, refusing to blink, refusing to look away, just as the shaman had warned. And the reflection. It had waited. It didn't copy her movements. It didn't even move. It just stood there, its grin widening, its empty black eyes boring into her soul. She hadn't blinked. She hadn't given in. And as dawn approached, it had finally faded, sinking back into the darkness of the mirror. For the first time in days, Sua felt like she had won. She had survived. She was safe. But she was wrong. It wasn't finished with her yet. Something is wrong at work. By midday, Sua was back at the bank, trying to act normal. She greeted customers, processed transactions, and forced herself to smile as if everything was fine. But something felt off. Her coworkers kept glancing at her strangely, whispering behind her back. Even her manager, Mr. Adebayo, kept throwing her uneasy looks. Finally, her best friend Tommy pulled her aside. Sua, she hesitated. Are you feeling okay? Sua frowned. Yeah, why? Tommy chewed her lip. It's just, people have been saying you're acting weird. Sua's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Tommy hesitated, then reached for her phone. I didn't want to show you this, but the security footage from yesterday. He played the video. Sua leaned in, her heartbeat pounding. At first, it was normal, just footage of herself working at her desk. But then, she saw it. Her reflection in the glass partition wasn't copying her. While her real self counted cash and spoke to customers, her reflection was staring at the customers, at her coworkers, at the camera, completely motionless. And then, as if knowing she was watching, The reflection tilted its head slowly and grinned. Sua gasped, dropping the phone. Tommy grabbed her wrist. Sua, what the hell is going on? Sua had no words. She could barely breathe. Because she remembered that moment. She had been completely unaware that her reflection was doing anything strange. Her hands trembled as she turned to look at the glass partition. Her reflection was back to normal. But now, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The phone call. Sua left work early. She told her manager she was feeling sick, and honestly, it wasn't a lie. She had barely stepped outside the bank when her phone rang. Unknown caller. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the reject button. But something deep inside her whispered, "Answer it." So she did. She lifted the phone slowly to her ear. "Hello." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft, familiar whisper. "Let me out." Sua's blood turned to ice. Her own voice. It was her own voice whispering from the other end of the line. "Let me out, Sua." She screamed and threw the phone onto the pavement, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't pick it up. She just ran. Smashing the mirrors. Sua's apartment had never felt safe, but now it felt suffocating. She grabbed a wooden stool and immediately began smashing every mirror in the house. The bathroom mirror shattered in a shower of glass. The vanity mirror cracked into 1,000 pieces. The small compact mirror in her purse was crushed under her foot. She was breathing hard, sweat dripping down her back, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. It was over. She had destroyed them all. Except one. The largest mirror. The full-length one in her bedroom. The one she had covered with a cloth days ago. Sua's entire body went rigid. Slowly, she turned toward it. She knew. She knew what was waiting for her beneath that cloth. Her hands shook as she reached forward, gripping the fabric. She took a deep breath. And ripped it away. Her reflection was waiting. But this time, it wasn't inside the mirror. It was stepping forward. "It's here." Sua couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She watched, frozen in horror, as her reflection stepped out of the glass, one slow, deliberate foot at a time. It looked like her. It had her face, her body, her clothes. But it wasn't her. Its grin was too wide. Its eyes were bottomless black voids. It tilted its head, watching her with curiosity, like a predator studying its prey. Sua took a staggered step back. The thing that looked like her took a step forward. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. The thing mimicked her movements, but there was something wrong. Something off. It moved too smoothly, too gracefully, as if its bones were made of liquid shadows. Then, it spoke. "You took too long, Sua." Its voice was her own. But it was distorted, stretched, like a recording played too slow. "Now, it's my turn." Sua screamed. She turned and ran. The escape. She bolted out of her apartment, her mind racing. She had to get away. Had to get far away from that thing. Her feet slammed against the pavement, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't stop running until she was blocks away, surrounded by the noise of the city, the honking of cars, the chatter of people, the normalcy of everyday life. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe she was safe. But then, she saw her reflection in a storefront window. And it wasn't running. It was smiling. And it raised its hand. And waved. The final confrontation. Sua ran until she could barely breathe. Her legs ached, her throat bound, and her mind was spiraling into terror. No matter how far she went, no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape it. Because her reflection wasn't inside the mirror anymore. It was loose. Walking. Watching. And it wanted to take her place. There was only one person who could help her now. She needed to go back to the shaman. She needed to end this. Before it ended her. The last warning. The village was shrouded in mist by the time she arrived. She stumbled up the hill, her body drenched in sweat, her heart hammering. The shaman was waiting outside, as if he had known she was coming. His expression was grim. "It has already begun, hasn't it?" he murmured. Sue nodded frantically. "It's not in the mirror anymore. It's walking. It's real." The shaman closed his eyes, his shoulders heavy with an unspoken weight. "Then we have little time." He led her inside, lighting an incense burner, filling the small hut with the scent of burnt sage and ancient herbs. Then, he took out the enchanted mirror, the one he had given her before. Sua's hands shook as she took it from him. "This is your last chance, child," the shaman warned. "You must lower it back inside." Sua swallowed hard. "How?" The shaman's cloudy eyes locked onto hers. "Hold the mirror before it. Force it to see its own reflection. But be careful, Sua." His voice lowered, heavy with warning. "If you look directly into its eyes for too long." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sua already knew what would happen. The waiting shadow. The city streets felt emptier than usual when Sua returned home. The air was thicker. Wrong. Every shadow stretched too far. Every light flickered too often. It was waiting for her. She stepped into her apartment, clutching the enchanted mirror tightly. The moment the door closed behind her, the lights flickered violently. The walls bent inward, as if the entire apartment had become unstable, shifting between realities. And then, a whisper. "Sua." Her blood turned to ice. She slowly turned. There, standing just a few feet away, was her reflection. But it wasn't just a copy of her anymore. It was twisted. Darker. Its skin was smoother than glass, its eyes deep pools of blackness, its grin too wide, too knowing. "Welcome home." Sua's hands tightened around the mirror. "You don't belong here," she whispered. The reflection's grin widened. "But I do." Then, the walls shivered. The air crackled like static. And suddenly, Sua wasn't in her apartment anymore. The world inside the mirror. Sua stood in a place that was almost familiar, but horribly wrong. Her apartment was here, but it was distorted, the furniture floating, the walls stretching endlessly into darkness. Mirrors lined every surface. And inside them, countless reflections of her stared back. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They only watched. "Isn't it beautiful?" Sua whirled around. The reflection was standing behind her, its arms outstretched. "This is where I come from," it murmured. "This is where I was born." Sua's chest tightened. "And this is where you will stay." The reflection took a step closer. "Think about it, Sua," it purred. "In this world, time does not touch you. No aging. No pain. No fear. Just endless beauty." Its black eyes gleamed. "Let me take your place, and you will never have to suffer again." Sua's hands shook. For a split second, just 1 second, she imagined it. A world where she would be untouched by time. A world where she could live forever in perfect stillness. The reflection smiled, sensing her hesitation. "All you have to do is say yes. The trap is set." Sua's breath came in sharp gasps. She clutched the enchanted mirror tightly, sweat dripping down her back. "I know what you really are. The reflection's smile faltered. Sua raised the mirror. Its surface shimmered, glowing faintly under the twisted light of the mirrored world. "You are not me." The reflection hissed, its smile vanishing, replaced with something twisted and inhuman. "You dare defy me?" The world shuddered violently. The mirrors cracked. The reflections began to move, shifting in eerie, unnatural ways. The entity's form flickered, as if struggling to hold its shape. "Look at me," it roared. Sua closed her eyes. She refused to look into its gaze. Instead, she held up the enchanted mirror and turned it toward the creature. And the moment its own reflection met its eyes, it screamed. The reflection breaks. The entity clawed at the air, its form distorting wildly. The mirrors around them shattered one by one, the world inside the glass collapsing in on itself. "No. You cannot trap me again." Sua kept her grip firm, forcing the creature to stare into its own abyss. It howled, its voice twisting into something inhuman and ancient. The ground began to crack beneath their feet. The walls dissolved into liquid glass. The reflection's form collapsed inward, its shadowy essence being dragged back into the enchanted mirror. "No!" With one final screech, the entity was sucked into the glass. The moment it disappeared, the world snapped back into place. Sua found herself back in her apartment, standing in front of her full-length mirror. But now, the glass was dark. And inside it, she could see something moving. Something trapped. Something screaming silently from the other side. "The door is closed." Or is it? The screams were swallowed by the mirror's endless darkness. Sua watched as the reflection entity twisted and contorted, its body collapsing inward, sucked into the enchanted glass like a shadow being pulled into a void. Its blackened eyes burned with rage, its mouth stretching wide in a final silent shriek. And then, crack! The mirror shattered. A violent shockwave rippled through the room, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. Sua stumbled backward, shielding her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air grew still. The room was silent. It was over. Her reflection was gone. The entity was trapped forever. Sua collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to close her eyes. And this time, when she did, there was no whispering. No tapping. No waiting shadow in the glass. Just silence. A new morning. Sunlight streamed through the curtains. Sua's eyes fluttered open, her body aching with fatigue. For a moment, she didn't move. She was afraid to. Afraid that if she turned her head, she'd see something waiting for her. But when she finally forced herself to look, there was nothing. Just her bedroom. Her apartment. Her life. She sat up slowly, blinking against the soft glow of morning. Everything felt different. Lighter. Normal. She dragged herself to the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. And then, she looked into the mirror. Her reflection stared back. Perfectly normal. No delay. No smiling when she wasn't. No dark eyes watching her from another world. Just her. Sua let out a shaky laugh. She touched her own face, then watched as her reflection did the same. It was really over. She was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. Life goes on. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Sua resumed her normal life, grateful to be rid of the nightmare. She returned to work, spent time with Tommy, and even started seeing her family more often. She avoided mirrors at first, hesitant to trust them. But over time, she stopped flinching when she saw her reflection. It moved normally now. It was just a reflection. Nothing more. Nothing else. Or so she thought. The final glimpse. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sua walked past a row of shops in the city market. She was carrying groceries, humming softly to herself, feeling lighter than she had in months. Then, she passed a storefront window. She almost didn't notice it. Almost. But something made her glance at the glass. And for a split second, her reflection hesitated. Sua's heart stopped. She took a step back, staring at the window. Her reflection was normal. Perfectly normal. She lifted her hand. So did the reflection. She blinked. So did the reflection. She turned her head. And her reflection did not move. Sua's breath caught in her throat. She felt her stomach churn with dread. Her fingers went cold as she watched her reflection stand completely still, even though she had already turned away. And then, it raised its hand. And waved. The world tilted. Sua stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering to herself, "No, no, no. It's over. It's over." She forced herself to look again. Her reflection was normal. It was back to mirroring her perfectly. Like nothing had happened. Like it had never hesitated at all. Sua's throat felt dry. She swallowed hard. And then, she walked away. Never looking back. But deep inside, she knew. Somewhere. Somehow. The door had never truly closed. And one day, it might try to open again.